Hello and welcome to this Ukraine war update, where we'll review the evolution of combat techniques, new weapons and key trends. Ukraine is on the defensive 99% of the time, but traditional trenches are now unsuitable.
So the soldiers live in kinds of underground shelters from which they come out as little as possible, for example, to repel assaults or to launch drones.
Life is mostly waiting now, and the riskiest moments are during rotations, as that's when they're most exposed to FPVs. We also see an increase in suicide ground robots, which carry up to 30 kilograms of explosives. This lets them strike enemy soldiers even inside shelters. Here, a Ukrainian robot targets a Russian shelter. Russia has equaled Ukraine in the number of kamikaze drones, making the situation unbearable for both sides. Capable of striking up to 20 kilometers behind the lines on each side, targeting any vehicle or gathering. Severe logistics damage and, sadly for Ukraine, suffering for civilians as Russia aims to make life unbearable. We also notice a very large number of drone videos where they are simply placed, waiting for a target to arrive. Whether vehicles, supply routes or soldiers on foot. And generally, there are fixed-wing drones flying that serve as communication relays to control these drones, including behind the front line. In terms of casualties, FPVs now cause 2/3 of the human losses, followed by mines and finally by artillery. And lastly, only firearms. Meanwhile, FPVs cause 80% of material losses around the line of contact. To counter this, we see a multiplication of turtle tanks or even porcupine tanks, like this model, hoping the drones explode before hitting the armor. Most other material losses are from mines, obviously on the front line, but also in the rear, when there are mine launching systems in depth, like this Russian truck, which can target rear roads and disrupt logistics. This also affects civilians crossing the region, showing the intensity of what can happen in rear areas. The Ukrainian fighters I speak with go to the front, to line 1 or line 0. They now prefer fast, open pickups over closed armored vehicles, driving at 40-60 km/h. In the fields, especially where they have shotguns, which is really their only defense against kamikaze drones, especially against artificial intelligence or fiber optics that can't be jammed. So, to move the front, the Russians continue to have dominance in artillery, but against the current Ukrainian defenses, the results are relatively mediocre. It's mostly due to 150-200 daily assault attempts that things change slightly. In the method of these assaults, there are still just as many small vehicles, a great number of them, which make it easier to escape from FPVs. The number of targets also overwhelms the Ukrainian defense. But there are also a lot of infiltration attempts that are simply done on foot, often by groups of 6 to 10 people who try to sneak through like that between 2 Ukrainian hideouts. Armored vehicles appear occasionally, but they've been very rare since June. And it rather seems like they're there to attract the FPVs, which gives more of a chance to the soldiers who reach the contact line. We also notice that our armies still often use tactical advances behind armored vehicles during training. Well, that's something that has simply completely disappeared in Ukraine. You absolutely have to stay away from armored vehicles if you want to survive. Sometimes, Russians advance using refrigerated ponchos to avoid detection, including by drones which have infrared capabilities, but in the vast majority of cases these attempts fail. There are fields of corpses stretching as far as the eye can see along much of the front. But when part of the group manages to advance, they simply try to bring more soldiers into that area to build up enough numbers that will allow them to continue. Also to capture the small Ukrainian strongholds, which usually have fewer than 10 people. And it's thanks to this method that they've managed to take about 10 square kilometers per day since June. But I'll tell you all about that in detail. For nearly 3 weeks, the grey weather has prevented Ukrainians from flying their observation drones, which makes it easier for the Russians to gather troops dozens of kilometers deep. Ukrainians can no longer spot them, so Russians have resumed major offensives with dozens of armored vehicles in recent weeks. For now, it's not really a success. We'll review the technical aspects, statistics, frontline changes, and what's happening in the air. We'll begin with the territorial control changes. The Russians captured 1% of Ukrainian territory in 1,000 days, averaging 350 square kilometers per month in 2025. They can't slow down now, having taken just 253 square kilometers in September. And the Russian advance seems to be falling back again in October. If we focus on the Donetsk Oblast, which is supposed to be Russia's main strategic objective, they still need 6,300 square kilometers in Donetsk Oblast to fully control it. To give you perspective, they've taken the last 6,300 square kilometers in Donetsk Oblast since spring 2023. They took 2.5 years to capture that area, so there's no reason for that to change. They'll need another 2.5 years of war to reach that goal. That's why I often say the war isn't sustainable long-term for either Russia or Ukraine. Because in terms of the human toll on Russia, there are 220,000 Russian deaths recorded in the Osilti databases, of which 135,000 are known by name. With their age, rank and assignment, this is especially possible due to the names shown on new war memorials across Russia. And here we're only talking about the dead, since we also have to add the missing, the wounded and the prisoners. And that's why we had this goal of exceeding 1 million losses. On the Russian side, the data is less reliable. In recent months, you can see that it's dropping massively, but actually that's because there's a delay of several months between a death and the time it's recorded. Hackers obtained lists, including a Russian document listing 280,000 losses for 2025, 87,000 deaths and 34,000 missing. And we still have Russian officials who, for the first time, have confirmed that the war has cost the lives of several 100,000 Russian soldiers. Russia boasts of having recruited 1.4 million soldiers since 2022, yet its army has only grown from 900,000 to 1,320,000 soldiers. So we can infer that the million losses match these numbers too. Because Korean soldiers' presence was initially denied and later confirmed, we still have trolls today who deny these million losses. But in reality, it's confirmed by the numbers. And now we even have Russian officials who are starting to admit it as well. On the Ukrainian side, there are now 150,000 dead and missing, based on available open source data, which you can also check on ULOSIS. When full lists are revealed, like with the 30th Ukrainian Mechanized Brigade, we find over 80% of losses were already known. Ukraine is likely nearing 600,000 military losses, counting the seriously wounded. If we now move on to material losses, only talking about what is proven, we have confirmed 23,000 Russian losses, including 6,500 tanks and vehicles, while Ukraine nears 10,000 losses. In terms of pace, we can see that losses have dropped significantly since mid-June and have remained at a low level up to today, with the vast majority of losses being on logistical vehicles or troop transport vehicles. And when we look at the details of the equipment lost by Russia, the share of oldest, least effective equipment keeps rising and now makes up to 90% of losses. In this category, troop transports like the multi-purpose towed light armored vehicle and BMP-1 now make up a growing proportion. And we can see the same thing with tanks that are older than the T-64, which continue to increase, especially with more and more T-55 tanks, which were designed just after World War II. If we now do the traditional tour of the front, starting with the Kherson area, well, there hasn't been any change, obviously. On terrain control, no contact zone, just a few skirmishes on Dnipro's central islands. But almost all of the losses are related to first-person view kamikaze drones, glide bombs and artillery. We have seen a rise in drones with artificial intelligence or thermal vision in recent months. These are Ukrainian images, but there's little to add except the rise in this kind of footage. However, we have seen the return of Bayraktar TB, 2 drones in the area. That also means fewer Russian radars are operational. This means the Ukrainians destroyed them, as today we mainly saw Bayraktars over the Black Sea in a maritime environment. It's still a good sign for the Ukrainians that they're returning to the veiled coasts or crossing over land. On the Russian side, they share many images showing destruction of Ukrainian targets and attacks on civilians, which they openly brag about. And even an open attack on United Nations convoys with an official complaint from the United Nations, but as usual, nobody cares. There is absolutely no response at the international level. Russia is taking hits further south in Crimea. Its air defense can't stop Ukraine's growing low-cost missile attacks, including the Feodosia base, whose destruction can be seen in satellite images. But there are also more and more drones that are piloted all the way to impact, even though we're still several hundred kilometers from the front. This enables destroying planes like the Antonov 2666 and helicopters such as the Mi-8S. New amphibious operations use heavy drones like Baba Yaga, which launch from boats that act as Starlink communication relays. All this is to destroy a NEBOM radar worth over $100 million designed to detect UAVs at long range. And even stealth planes, and I refer you to this video where I talk about detecting stealth aircraft over the Black Sea. We can also see that there is a Russian patrol boat that had the bad idea to come and patrol, and apparently it's a success since it managed to find a drone. In Zaporizhia Oblast, Russian assaults have been repelled for months. But the evolution of the front is therefore negligible, and they took advantage of the bad weather to resume mechanized assaults starting from October 10th. Here, it's an assault on Charkove. First came waves of motorcycles, then a column of 35 tanks and AFVs. Confirmed losses include 19 armored vehicles, 41 motorcycles, 107 Russians killed, and at least 51 wounded. That's just for the footage that was shared by the Ukrainians and the few survivors. Apparently, they were caught off guard. So, aside from these rare attempts, there are probably quite a few logistical convoys being attacked on both sides. Here, you can see strikes on the Ukrainian rear and on the Russian side. There were two major hits on railways with fuel trains that were attacked south of Tokmak. After the train stopped, a rampage began, destroying every tanker. Once again, this shows how effective Ukrainian piloted drones are, even against moving targets, at ranges of several dozen kilometers. We can also mention some significant losses on the Russian side, notably a TOS-1A thermobaric rocket launcher, as well as the loss of an S-400 radar to a remotely operated munition. In the east, Russians also captured several villages in the Dnipro region. The Ukrainians likely lacked strong reserves here, but the front is now stable in this area. There as well, it's mainly shelling of logistics and airstrikes that should be noted. And we should also highlight the bombing of a coal mine in broad daylight by Russia, which trapped 190 Ukrainian miners on October 20th. Upon arriving in Donetsk Oblast, the most active front area, particularly near Pokrovsk, we had some scares this summer, mainly because Russia infiltrated nearly 20 kilometers behind the contact line. This caused concern about a breakthrough, but they couldn't take advantage of it. The Ukrainians launched a small counter-offensive to cut off the bridgehead, resulting in several successive pockets. And already several hundred Russian prisoners are trapped, unable to be rescued or supplied. Overall, Russian advances continue everywhere, though very slowly, with catastrophic logistics losses on both sides. Here, these are Russian motorcycles weaving between dozens of vehicle wrecks to get closer to the front. These images were filmed just east of Pokrovsk, and we also have these from the Ukrainian side. An impressive number, likely all hit by FPVs, since there are no visible shell craters on the ground. Maybe some kind of ambush that the Russians managed to carry out, and yet we're well north of Pokrovsk. So, as I was saying, the most dangerous moment for pretty much everyone in this area is during rotations. And here, for example, you can see a Russian gathering point with soldiers who have been tracked from the moment they left their trench to this location. Each vehicle will then be struck by a kamikaze drone. And besides the suffering in the depths that makes any movement difficult, the CIA continues to launch dozens of infantry assaults. Just to test, like here, where these poor guys cross huge fields only to be killed, the Russians aim to check if the axis is monitored, and we see similar images along the front almost daily. If these scouts survive, the Russians advance. Ukrainian forces are increasingly using ground robots with loudspeakers and 12.7M machine guns in defense. This lets infantry and armored vehicles enter and operate. Here are images. The 23rd Mechanized Brigade in Vesly, recently captured by Russian forces. But in any case, the Russians managed to reach the city of Pokrovsk itself on the southern flanks. They've continued making progress since August 2024. It's very, very slow, it's very, very costly, but gradually they still manage to make progress and move forward. We think an urban battle is about to start. That also means the Russians need a much higher attacker-to-defender ratio, and it's not clear that they'll be able to achieve it. What about the bad weather returning, which stops drones from showing Russian assaults? We're seeing large mechanized assaults by Russia again, like the recent attempt north of Pokrovsk using 22 armored vehicles, but the mining that had been put in place, along with the work of drones and artillery, made it possible to destroy the assault. These large armored and mechanized assaults will likely end with the Rasputitsa, expected in a few weeks, even before reaching the Ukrainian contact line. Once the rains have really started, there might be armored vehicles again once the ground has frozen. But in any case, it's a period that lasts a few weeks, and for now we don't see any success. Despite the assaults, which are still significant and once again the most important since June in terms of the number of vehicles involved. So this description of the situation I'm giving you around Pokrovsk could be exactly the same in almost every city along the front lines, which today are as many strongholds as the Ukrainians are defending, as much as they can. For example, in Toretsk, where fighting started in June 2024, the same goes for the city of Chasiv Yar, which is only 6 kilometers west of Bakhmut, and where urban fighting began in April 2024. Here, these are images from the city on October 17, and you can see the weather, which completely prevents the use of drones. Further north, near Siversk, a grey area of uncertainty is expanding, simply because the shelters where the Ukrainians and the Russians are located are increasingly interwoven on both sides. It's now nearly impossible to know who controls each field and tree line. So there aren't really any significant events in the Russian methods in the area, so we can't make a list of all the war crimes or attacks they've carried out against civilians. But we can still highlight the destruction of a Russian Mi-8 helicopter by a simple first-person view kamikaze drone at the end of September. A scene that was filmed from several angles, and you have to imagine that we're more than 9 kilometers behind the front line. So even helicopters flying very low are also being spotted and shot down. We should also highlight the major use of glide bombs, with thousands dropped by the Russians to target Ukrainian defenses. Luckily for Ukrainians, accuracy remains fairly low, and I would refer you to the work of Clément Molin, who has done remarkable work in open source intelligence to catalogue all these impacts. On the Ukrainian side, images mainly show real successes using these glide bombs. Notably, France now produces 100 A2SEM hammer bombs per month. To prepare these attacks, you need planes. Legour managed to destroy several radars and S-300 launchers. This opens up the sky for the aircraft that will then be able to drop their bombs on the Kharkiv front all the way in the north. Well, also, fewer direct assaults, so there are more deep strikes here, with Ukrainian fiber optic FPVs against Russian cannons. But the Russians also persist in systematic destruction, such as heavily bombarding this village with artillery. Then, when people come out to try to escape, they send FPVs. This is, for example, what we see here with a woman, a civilian, who, once other people try to help her, the Russians send a second first-person view to kill everyone nearby. Unfortunately, we see this method used. The Russians often target civilians, prompting rescuers to respond. They perform a double tap, first a glide bomb, then another 20 minutes later when rescuers arrive. And now it's something we also see regularly, unfortunately, against civilians that we see in the frontline area. Remember, the front line now reaches cities like Kramatorsk, which are dozens of kilometers behind the lines. So the Russians target civilians to hit the military who might be in the area. In any case, once the Russians have managed to, they will launch assaults that could destroy this village. We have many videos of Ukrainian first-person view kamikaze drones, enough to target every Russian soldier. What we can also see the high image quality, even at impact, meaning the Russians lack electronic warfare or jammers. Ukrainian vehicles by name. On their side, we're just going to focus on a particular case. This would reportedly be the first use of an artificial intelligence piloted drone swarm. Only one pilot will guide a first-person view to its target, with the other first-person viewers following behind. Up to the area where they're told to wait, the operator will use the first drone, then each remaining drone one by one. And that makes it more efficient, meaning they know exactly where they are. And it also helps reduce the time, because they don't need to restart. First-person view from several kilometers away allows them to launch drones consecutively, significantly boosting the effectiveness of these strikes. Urban fighting continues in the Vovchansk area on the Russian border, but territory remains unchanged. And near Sumy, where Russia attempted a major offensive this summer, that offensive has collapsed and the front is now completely stable, even though there is still a lot of activity. We can point out a synchronized attack by 6 FPVs on a Ukrainian armored personnel carrier. Do you see that the first 4 FPVs are targeting this Swedish PZB 302 while the last 2 are staying back? They wait for the soldiers to come out so they can kill them. That's typical, since Russians know Western equipment offers better survival rates. Soviet equipment is usually destroyed with one hit, but Western gear is tougher. They are more and more often setting up traps, a series of FPVs to take them out. Then they try to kill those who manage to escape. So after the combat techniques, now we'll focus a bit on the equipment. With this ongoing drone war, RRR continuing here against a rare and valuable Russian forepost. Shotguns mounted on drones, drone hunters. And we've also seen the first operational uses of drones capable of firing anti-tank 4S, which are basically bazookas for defense. In the Ukrainian trenches, we also see more and more remotely operated cannons, which helps avoid putting yourself in danger. Within first-person view range to be able to repel assaults, and against fiber optic first-person view kamikaze drones, Ukraine is increasing use of these small systems, spinning barbed wires in fields, which let them cut the wires. And so it allows entire sections of the front to be protected. At first glance, it's relatively effective, especially in large fields, but you can't put it in front of the zero line. So it's only effective after the Ukrainians fall back. in terms of long-distance warfare. The goal is obviously to wear down the opponent, and there's a big difference in the methods. Ukraine is clearly achieving successes. For example, this map I'm linking shows all successful long-distance attacks sorted by type. You can see many arms factories, ammo depots, refineries, and military airports. Each time there are links so you can verify the evidence of these successes. And on the other hand, Russia targets anything and everything. Urban heating systems, electricity, running water, and many residential buildings. So, it's a real war against the population aiming to wear out the civilians. The big difference this year, though, is that Ukraine now has the means to make Russia go through exactly what it went through. Zelensky said so. If you attack our power systems, we also have the ability to do the same this year. During the last attack, major outages occurred in Russia's Belgorod area. It's a response to the Russian attack, so the Ukrainians are defending themselves again. But this time, they said they won't let themselves be attacked without responding. This year, they also have the means to attack, so they're able to cut off funding for the Russian army. Russia aims to break Ukrainians' will to defend themselves. On the interception rate side, for Ukraine, it remains relatively stable, around 90% for the Shaheds, despite an increase in their number. Intercepting, 90% of 300 Shaheds lets 30 through, but 90% of 500 means 50 get through. So, logically, the number of hits increases, even if the interception rate is also improving. Especially with the multiplication of different methods, large numbers of machine guns on the ground. Whether it's operated by radar or fired directly from large pickup trucks, there's also the work of helicopters. We see a lot of videos where Mi-8s shoot down these Shaheds. Fighter jets typically intercept cruise missiles, which usually fly at about 800 km/h. We also have a few examples with laser-guided rockets like in this image, or interceptions with missiles against other missiles. Because missiles are scarce, they're used only as a last resort. The main difficulty is really against ballistic missiles. Apparently only the Patriot Advanced Capability 3 air defense batteries are effective. There's hardly any protection nationwide, so more than 90% of these missiles will get through. Fortunately, they're very expensive, they're very rare, and Russia has very few of them. However, it still causes significant damage, and its low accuracy means residential buildings are often hit too. On the Russian side, they haven't needed as much protection from Ukrainian drones and missiles. They don't have networks of machine guns on their territory. They haven't developed drone interceptors, so the interception rate is much lower. Ultimately, the Ukrainians launch significantly fewer drone missiles than the Russians. It seems like there are more hits on Russian territory than on Ukrainian territory. We suspect the Russians will need to catch up to the Ukrainians in developing these methods. That means thousands of soldiers will need to stay in the rear to fire at the sky in case missiles or drones fly by. And that also means a lot of resources they'll have to pull from the front to put in the rear. So the conclusion of all this is that the Russian war objective hasn't changed. Putin reaffirmed it again this summer. All of Ukraine should be Russian. He continues to reject the ceasefire accepted by Ukrainians last March. But there's no reason for the military balance to actually change. Survival for the soldiers is simply becoming more and more horrible. Logistics is now almost as dangerous as being on the front line. In a few weeks, the Rasputitsa will once again make armored vehicles vanish for a while. Artillery, drones and missiles will keep causing losses on both sides. Unfortunately, Ukrainian civilians are paying a growing price, as Russia believes this is its only achievable strategic objective. It can't conquer Ukraine militarily, so it wants to break Ukrainian morale and economy by targeting civilians. So, hitting people behind the lines isn't a mistake, they do it on purpose. Conquering Ukraine militarily is impossible, so they seek alternatives, and the war will end only when Russia is forced to stop. This means there could be an economic collapse, which the Ukrainians are actively trying to cause. Our sanctions act as a slow poison taking time to work. Today, it's clear that without sanctions, Russia would be much stronger, so we definitely shouldn't lift them. And we also hope that Ukraine can receive more equipment, since the level of support for Ukraine has remained stable for quite a while now, while the Russians were betting on a decrease. But we also have high hopes for the use of the 200 billion euros in frozen assets, not just the dividends from these assets, but actually using the money to better equip Ukraine. This possibility is gaining increasing serious support. So really on that side, at least it's a small hope for the Ukrainians. Even though economic collapse is still the top priority, since it's the fastest way to achieve a ceasefire, and therefore peace. I'm sharing all the information. You can find the sources I mentioned in the video comments. You can also support humanitarian efforts in Ukraine with your donations. or with the fundraiser dedicated to the military, who choose themselves what type of equipment they will get. And also there are new super patches that you can choose to support different brigades, and these are limited edition collectible patches.